안녕하십니까. 저는 윤선희라고 합니다. 다시 반갑습니다. For the purposes of our guests today, of which we have so many very valuable guests, I'm going to conduct my presentation in English. Let me start by thanking the CONSORN-Worldwide family and its leadership for inviting me here today. The World Food Programme and CONSORN-Worldwide are very important partners in many of the countries where we both operate. I myself have had personal experience of working with, in cooperation with CONSORN a long time ago when I was based in Sudan. And so it's really very important and a very meaningful occasion for me to be here today at the launch of this very important this report. Without further ado, perhaps I could start my presentation. It really is building on what we have already heard from the speakers before me, where through this report we really are being faced with this unprecedented global hunger at a scale that we have not seen, at least in our lifetimes. And so the presentation I will be giving you today is more a view from my organization, the United Nations World Food Programme, how we view the situation, the global situation today, and a little snapshot of what we in WFP are doing in terms of responding. So allow me just to spend just a few seconds just to share with you a background of who we are, the World Food Programme. We are a United Nations organization. We are based in Rome, Italy, together with other food and agriculture related UN organizations. We work in over 120 countries, and we have operations in almost 90. And we work in all regions of the world. We are actually the largest humanitarian organization in terms of footprint. We have over 21,000 staff. And we're very proud to call ourselves an operational agency where most of our staff are actually based in the front line, in the field. In fact, almost 90% of our staff are working in the front lines. Because of the work that we do when it comes to emergencies and humanitarian response, the World Food Programme has also built up a very global and sophisticated large-scale logistics and delivery network that not only supports our own operations, but it is a service that we undertake on behalf of the wider humanitarian community, both UN and NGOs as well as government organizations. And we also lead on the emergency telecommunications sector, especially in contexts where there's been a sudden disaster and network or telecommunication systems are temporarily down. The World Food Programme, surprisingly, comes in and we lead in providing emergency telecommunication services. And through our various food assistance programs, we also strive and have mainstreamed innovative solutions that really are a foundation for many of the assistance programs that we provide in the countries where we operate. While we are very well known for our emergency response and the work that we do in humanitarian and relief programs, what we are less known for are some of the longer-term development work that we do. So the World Food Programme actually has dual mandate. We deliver food assistance in emergencies to save lives, but we also work with communities and with governments to improve nutrition and build resilience in more longer-term, multi-year, development-oriented programs. And so here, some of the programs that you may have heard of are things like school feeding, food for asset creation, and other a diverse range of capacity strengthening and technical assistance programs that we do in many of the countries where we work, including some of the more protracted and crises and countries where there are some where there is some instability, but where we feel some of these longer-term programs are possible to do or at least start. Now, let's focus on what we've heard already today, that the world is faced with an unprecedented global crisis. If we take ourselves back to 2008, I know there's a lot of young people here who may not remember or know what happened in 2008, but really, going back to 2008, where there was a sudden increase in food prices. The world was grappling with some very similar challenges that we see today. But compared to today, there weren't the same levels or the number of wars that we see around us today. You put on the news, you've got Syria, you've got Yemen. These have been going on for years and years and years. You've got Ethiopia, something that exploded more recently. You've got the ongoing conflict and instability in northeast Nigeria. Then you've also got the climate disaster, the climate catastrophe, something that we have been seeing more of and hearing more of now with the COP27, as we heard earlier, compared to 2008, where there was again a shock in the world. We see more frequent and more severe climate crises, and these are happening more often. So they're happening consecutive years. We heard that in the Horn of Africa, there have been places that haven't had rain for 3 years. We've had countries that are facing these crises year after year after year without any chance or hope for recovery. So there's the climate factor. And then obviously we've also heard that the past 2 years, COVID-19 has been merciless, not just on the countries where we operate, but everywhere in the world. And even today, we can see that many of the countries are still struggling. So actually, all of this have built upon each other to kind of create what my executive director has been calling a perfect storm. And these crises are not happening in a vacuum. They're kind of layering one upon another. And so you've got not only increasing food prices and inflation, but you've got currencies where the values are dropping in remarkable speed, where the money just does not buy you what it used to. And at the same time, prices are rocketing. As I said, countries are still recovering from COVID, so people have lost their jobs. Economies are not yet back to what it should be. Supply chains still remain disrupted. So the markets are not functioning the way they used to be. And for the past 2 years or so, governments have been pouring, absolutely pouring, aid and stimulus programs in order to kind of keep its economies going. But this is in countries where they can afford to do that. In many of the countries where we operate, they just do not have that capacity. Now, going to the first C, which is conflict, the #1 driver of global hunger today. The conflict that broke out in Ukraine earlier this year was really something that kind of pushed everything back even more and really had this reverberation across the whole globe in ways that I don't think we were necessarily prepared for. And that's because of what Russia and Ukraine were in terms of the world's main food commodities. I mean, I don't think I need to go into this in too much detail, but they were the world's breadbasket, and not just for 1 or 2 commodities. They are for many of the staple commodities that the countries where we need to provide assistance depend on these imports of these grains and food commodities, as well as fuel and fertilizers, as we've heard. So in addition to the 3 C's, conflict, climate, COVID. We now have this other triple F situation, where the crisis that we see today is really a marriage or the coming together of the impact caused by rising food prices, rising fuel prices, and this issue of fertilizers. Yeah? And so this is just a map of different, layering different root causes behind what we're seeing today in terms of countries that are of high concern. And you can see many of the countries have already been covered by the Executive Director's presentation of the report that brings us here together. So there are multiple countries, multiple hotspots where we need to be monitoring the situation closely. So, well, what does this mean in numbers? Well, you know, there are many reports out there, but for WFP, the latest numbers indicate that there are almost 350 million people who are classified as acutely food insecure. This is about 200 million more than the number before COVID. 200 million more than before COVID. Out of this 350 million people, and just imagine, Korea is about 50-something million population. 350 million people are acutely food insecure. And of this, about 49 million of them, in 49 different countries, are in what we would call emergency levels or worse. So if there's 1 to 5, 5 being the worst, they are between 4 and 5. Out of that 49 million, about 1 million of this population group can be considered in a catastrophic condition, a condition that we can say is on the brink of famine. And by the time famine is declared, we should know that it's already too late. Because by the time famine is declared, already half the people who are affected would be dying. So the time is now, and now might even be too late. And we've heard some of the alarms for the Horn of Africa, Somalia, seeing numbers that we've never seen before. And many other countries are also of deep concern. And this is the illustration of some of the countries that WFP are monitoring through its corporate alert system. So when it comes to the Saving Lives mandate, what has WFP done so far? Okay, so there's this explosion of global hunger around the world. So what have we done, especially since Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine broke out? Well, there's a lot of things that we as WFP have been able to try and do to respond. So some of this is really making sure that we strengthen and activate, put in place and activate the various emergency protocols. And this means empowering leadership, setting up, simplifying procedures so that things are more efficient and things can be approved and implemented quicker. And making resources, human, financial, and otherwise, more accessible to those who are leading our response in the field. We've also got this thing called immediate response account. So often what happens is there's a crisis, we need to fundraise for it, we need to raise the resources, then that has to translate into assistance, and that takes months. So what WFP does is while we are triggering that, we will activate our immediate response account, which allows us to kickstart a response without delay, and then we can resource and replenish that account later. And so far, just since February this year, we have already disbursed through this account alone over $300 million in many countries. Other things that we've done is, everything that we do needs to be monitored, and so we've put in place presence in the field where we haven't had presence. Ukraine is one very good example, where before the conflict started, WFP wasn't working in Ukraine, so we had to start everything from scratch. And that takes time. Where we don't have access to the people who need our assistance, we negotiate the access. And this requires working with military structures and organizations and negotiating the access and deconflicting, doing deconflict, in conflicting areas. Another thing that we do is monitoring, as I mentioned. It's about data, having access to data, and being informed and having that informed decision-making. And so all of the maps that I showed you, these are based on data being collected real time that translates into hotspot analysis, early warning, where we can even anticipate what will come and what we need to do now before the crisis becomes a full-blown crisis. And last but not least, massive surge capacity. In response to unprecedented needs, this requires an unprecedented level of personnel who are deployed in the field. And so far, we have done that very, very well and at scale, with over 750 people mobilized and deployed this year alone, which is 3 times more than last year. And also standby partnerships, which means agreements that we make with our partners so that we share human resource expertise, and so I can tap into experts in concern, as an example, if I do not have that skill set, but I need to deploy someone. So these kinds of arrangements all help us respond to surge capacities. So I'm going to move through these slides very quickly because I think one of the areas, big areas, where WFP has been hit hard has been on the supply chain side. And things are not, by far, not nearly stabilizing. It's still very abnormal in terms of the supply chain. But in terms of food prices, since we've been able to start exporting some grains out of Ukraine, we've seen the highly fluctuating food prices stabilize a little bit. So this is good news. But the concern for us today is less the food price being high, but if the supply chain continues to constrain the things like export of fertilizers and access to fertilizers in countries like many of the African countries, for instance, what we see today as a food affordability situation, next year could become a food availability situation. And that's what concerns us, is that today we're talking about unprecedented numbers, but if the challenges with food, fuel, and fertilizer continues, many of the countries where a lot of the farmers are our beneficiaries will not be able to plant, will not be able to produce, and next year we will actually see the numbers get even worse. And that is what scares us. And this goes also towards the supply or the production of specialized nutritious products. Hunger and nutrition go hand in hand, and unfortunately 60 million children under 5 are malnourished, and half of the 350 million people I talked about who are acutely food insecure are unfortunately children. And so really keeping an eye on nutrition and access to making sure that these specialized nutritious products in terms of production are not challenged, and that it can keep up with demand is also something that WFP is working on with its partners and its suppliers. So just to recap, I've got very little time, but in response to the 350 million acutely food insecure people around the world, WFP's plan, our plan alone, is to try and reach about 160 million of them. And so far this year, we've managed to do about 133 million people. And one main program that has been very successful in reaching these beneficiaries has been our cash-based transfers. So even in fragile settings where some market activity is evident, we will not bring in food assistance, but we will, to the extent possible, provide cash so that the beneficiaries are able to purchase and have some decision-making in terms of what they are able to use and utilize. We continue, where possible, to always, alongside our relief programs, work with governments to strengthen social protection programs, especially in ways that can make them shock responsive. And so this is a very important priority for WFP, because as long as we are providing assistance directly, we can reach hundreds of millions. But the moment we start strengthening systems and working with governments, our assistance can benefit billions. And so social protection programs are of utmost importance to WFP. And perhaps I can really end here by speaking a little bit about the importance of partnership. In WFP, everything we do is through partnership. That's why it's not just SDG 2 that's in our strategic plan, but SDG 17, which is all about working in partnership. And we actually work with over 1,700 partners in the field. And this, I think, is part of our success in working very closely with communities despite the scale of our projects. It's because we work with and through our, namely our NGO partners on the ground, and this is how we are able to approach the situation from a kind of like a systems approach. And I'm just going to go over these because this is really more of a deep dive in terms of our Ukraine response. But I think I'll end my presentation here. Thank you very much.